She also grew tobacco, not the plantation's commercial crop, but a wild, ungrafted variety she had cultivated from seeds she obtained through channels that no one asked about directly, and no one thought it wise to investigate. This tobacco grew low and dense, its leaves broader and darker than the commercial strains, and it curled at the edges in a way that suggested age or stress or something in the soil that the plant was negotiating with. The woman who first brought this accumulation to Clement Harlan's attention was not a field worker. She was Theodora Prout, wife of the neighboring planter Wesley Prout, who had stopped her carriage along the boundary road one afternoon in late October and found herself staring at the perimeter of Cora's garden with an expression that the driver, who accompanied her, would later describe haltingly as something between fascination and revulsion. Theodora was a woman who prided herself on knowing plants. She kept a formal garden at the Prout house, maintained a small physic garden of medicinal herbs, and had studied several texts on botanical remedies that were fashionable among educated women of her class. She recognized some of what she saw, enough to ask questions. She sent a note to Clement Harlan that evening. The note was brief and did not explain itself fully, which in retrospect may have been more alarming than any direct statement would have been. It read, "Mr. Harlan, I observed today the garden of the woman you have stationed at your eastern boundary. I believe you should examine what is growing there before the season changes. Some of what I saw I could not name. Some of what I could name I would rather not put to paper. I remain as ever your neighbor in good faith." Clement Harlan walked to the eastern boundary the following morning, and he later recorded the visit in his ledger. The only personal observation he committed to writing among his otherwise purely numerical entries was the following. Visited the Rue cabin. Found extensive and unusual cultivation around the structure. Asked Cora about the nature of the plants. She was cooperative in manner and answered that she grew what was useful to her for cooking and medicine. She could not be faulted directly. The garden is in no way impeding the fieldwork. I will observe further. That phrase, "I will observe further," suggested that Clement had seen something he could not immediately categorize, and that his instinct in the absence of a clear category was to wait. He was a man of systems, and systems required data before they permitted conclusions. He observed further, and what he observed over the following weeks made him increasingly reluctant to observe at all. To understand what Cora had actually built around that cabin and why it had the effect it did, it is necessary to understand something about the world she inhabited, the knowledge she carried, and the particular geography of fear that governed the relationship between the plantation's enslaved population and the white men who moved through that world with such certainty. Cora had grown up on a plantation in Putnam County, one county, west, under the ownership of a man named Peregrine Slade, a figure who appears in surviving records as a minor planter, not particularly prosperous, not particularly notable. What the records do not capture is what Cora experienced in that household, or what she learned during her years there from an elderly woman named Mama Thistle, who was among the oldest people on the property and who carried knowledge that had traveled a very long distance. The provenance of that knowledge is difficult to reconstruct with certainty. The enslaved population of the Deep South in the antebellum period included individuals and families whose roots traced back to West African traditions, Yoruba, Dahomean, Fawn, that placed enormous importance on botanical knowledge, on the uses of plants not only as medicines but as spiritual markers, as communication between realms of meaning that Western European frameworks had no vocabulary to describe. This knowledge had survived the Middle Passage in fragments. It had adapted and hybridized with indigenous American plant knowledge and with the folk medicine traditions of poor white communities who shared geographic space with the enslaved, and had by the mid-19th century become something that was neither purely African nor purely American, but entirely its own. A living system of understanding that practitioners kept hidden from the men who owned them, for obvious and urgent reasons. Mama Thistle, by all accounts that can be reconstructed from later oral histories recorded in the area, had been a practitioner of what the people around her called simply the work. The specifics of her knowledge, what she grew, what she prepared, what she could determine from a plant's behavior in certain soils, were things she passed on selectively, and she had passed a great deal of it to Cora during the years they lived together on the Slade property. When Cora was sold and moved to the Harland plantation in 1834, she carried that knowledge with her. She spent more than 20 years at Harland watching, learning the local flora, understanding what the red clay of Baldwin County could sustain, and waiting. She had not been passive during those 20 years. She had helped women through difficult labors. She had eased the suffering of children with fevers. She had provided remedies for toothache and wound infection and the particular ailments that come from long years of outdoor labor in extreme heat. These services were rendered quietly, and they gave her a standing in the community of the Harland enslaved that had nothing to do with Clement's ledger. She was not feared by the people she helped. She was trusted, which is a different thing entirely. What she had built around her cabin was not, in the practical botanical sense, a threat to anyone's physical safety. The plants she cultivated were medicinal, many of them. Pennyroyal was widely used as a digestive and a fever remedy, sassafras as a blood purifier, black cohosh for the particular complaints of women. These were plants that any knowledgeable person in Georgia in 1857 might have grown without comment. The wild tobacco served purposes both practical and ritual. The unnamed dusk-flowering plants, which later accounts suggest may have been a variety of Jimson weed cultivated from seeds she had modified through selective planting over multiple seasons, were more ambiguous in their uses, and the ambiguity was intentional. Because what Cora had understood, with a clarity born from decades of observation, was this: she could not prevent what men like Clement Harland did with their power. She could not stop the sales, the separations, the endless extraction of labor from exhausted bodies. She could not undo what had been done to Solomon. She could not protect everyone, but she could build something around herself that those men did not understand. And in that gap between what they knew and what she knew, she could create a space that was, in the most fundamental sense, her own. A space that operated according to rules they had not written. The garden was not a weapon. It was a boundary, and it communicated to anyone who knew how to read plants, something that the era's laws and customs made impossible to state directly. By the spring of 1857, word about Cora's garden had spread among the enslaved population of the neighboring plantations in a way that had no equivalent in the world of the white planters around her. The field workers who passed the boundary on shared labor arrangements brought descriptions back to the Sutter, Prout, and Delavan properties. Women who came to Cora for help with their children or their own bodies saw the garden and understood in different degrees and different languages what it represented. A few of them began asking what they could do, what they could plant, what they could learn. Cora taught carefully and selectively, as Mama Thistle had taught her. Clement noticed the increased traffic at his eastern boundary. He noted it in his ledger. He did not fully understand what he was noting. And then came the summer of 1857, and the incident that would find its way eventually into a courthouse document in Baldwin County. The summer of 1857 was the driest in the region in more than a decade. By June, the creeks had dropped to half their normal levels, and the cotton in the central fields was showing signs of stress, the leaves curling inward at the edges during the hottest part of the day, a defensive response to moisture loss that Clement watched with the tight-jawed expression of a man calculating losses in real time. The neighboring planters were suffering similarly. Randolph Sutter had lost a section of his eastern field to what he believed was a fungal blight. Wesley Prout's well had gone brackish. Marcus Delavan, who had more capital to draw on, was purchasing water rights from a creek property 2 miles north and having it hauled by wagon.